Hi. So if you are here, then I am assuming that you are a member of the autistic community and you already know its history, culture, and priorities. I'm assuming that you also already know what neurodiversity is and you already take a disability rights frame in your work. I'm also assuming that you have some kind of advanced scientific training and you are planning to conduct research with AIRP in a scientific capacity. If these things do not apply to you, or if you're just curious, you may want to also view the training on neurodiversity and the autistic community, which covers those topics. But for this talk, I wanted to offer something for somebody who already knows that because you've lived it and are perhaps even a part of what creates it. So I'm just going to share a couple of high-level points that I think about a lot in terms of doing community-engaged research as an insider researcher, starting with the idea of disclosure and identity. So disclosing, as you know, that you're on the autistic spectrum and an autistic autism researcher is a personal decision, and it involves some complex risk-benefit assessments as well as considerations with other intersectional identities you may have, other things that possibly you might need to disclose or make disclosure decisions about. That said, I do strongly advocate for disclosing if you possibly can for a few reasons. One is that even non-autistic people, disclosure of your positionality as a researcher is a good thing and becoming increasingly important in autism research. Some journals are starting to require it. And I say it's a good thing because I think it's very much a reaction to that question of, were autistic people involved in this research? Who actually did this? Is this being filtered through a lens of somebody who legitimately knows anything about the experience of autism? Also, the more of us who disclose openly, the less stigmatized it becomes, the more normalized it becomes, the less risk it is for future generations of autism researchers, and maybe even less risk it is for ourselves in 5 or 10 years. That said, do take the current context of your situation, the current political landscape, all of those things into full account and do what is safe for you. As an insider researcher, you are incredibly valuable. Your scientific expertise combined with your lived experience is powerful and something that non-autistic researchers literally can never achieve. You know what the community's priorities are. You can keep them centered without having to fight to even understand in the first place. Your insider knowledge of the community and your lived experience as an autistic person can help you to design better research faster. For example, you might be designing a survey and you can ask yourself, would I understand what that means? And you're a good step closer than somebody who doesn't have an autistic brain might be. You also have built-in trust and rapport with your community collaborators on your project and with the community when you go to disseminate your research back out into the world. And that can save time and just feel good as a way of being active within the community. You're also valuable as a scientist, just anyway, without any of the insider stuff. And I'll get back around to that in a little bit. As insider researchers, we also have some limitations that we need to be careful to remember. So first, we have education, training, and perspectives that autistic people who have not been trained as scientists don't have, but might be critically important to your project. You are, by definition, we are, by definition, in a position of significantly greater privilege and power than many people in the community, because of our education and the amount of power that goes along with creating knowledge in a scientific and academic context. Sometimes we can also run into conflicting priorities between academic and community concerns. For example, juggling what we actually have for resources with what the community expects or with what the community even needs. And lastly, it can be really hard to what I call be all the things, because yeah, we can be all the things. We are all the things. But at the end of the day, we also need a good life work balance, and to work in a healthy way. And realistically, no one person can be everything, no matter how cross-sectional our experiences are. So how do we balance our positions and our identities within this context? One is to know that you're not, and you don't have to be, a substitute for collaborators from the autistic community at large. There is room for all of us. You don't have to be all the things. Consider where your combination of academic training and lived experience makes your work stronger, and where you may need to bring in community members who can offer different types of knowledge. For example, after getting my PhD, there is no way I will ever again know what it's like to have only a middle school reading level. And that might be an expertise that is of critical importance to the success of my project. Also consider your balance of career goals. You might be an insider researcher who's primarily an activist who does research to further those aims. You could also be a researcher who aligns with an activist agenda, and how you navigate where you fall on the science community continuum is going to be influenced by those aims. Know that negotiating power differentials is complicated, continuous, and you need to pay active attention to power just as much as the non-autistic researchers do. Yes, there are some ways that we are equally disempowered to others, but there are other ways, like I mentioned, where we, because of our position in the academy and as scientists, have more power. And that's something that can be tricky because we sometimes let our awareness slip when we're in community spaces. But that said, it is totally okay to relax and enjoy being part of those autistic community spaces with your community co-researchers. One of my very favorite things about doing community engaged research is that we get to create autistic spaces, and we get to do autistic research in an autistic way, which is amazing and has a lot of potential to be incredibly transformative. Because some things could use some transformation. We are all aware that there is a lot of ableism within the academy. And to that end, congrats on even making it here. I don't need to convince you that it can be hard for us to navigate an academic system that does not take a neurodiversity approach to how it functions. I also want to just give a word of thanks to the people who paved that way for us, and to note that we here now, as this generation of autism researchers, we are paving that way forward for those who become our mentees and who come after us. So hopefully conditions through that will improve over time. But for now, some things that come up for me a lot related to community engaged research as an insider researcher. So the first there's a couple of types of bias arguments that I run into a lot. One is this: there's no way to eliminate bias if you're an insider researcher. And sometimes this is a disciplinary issue. There are some fields where bias is a much bigger thing than others, and you might need to take a different approach to how you explain, depending on the type of research. Connected to that can be a paradigmatic issue, for example, positivist versus constructivist frames. Sometimes I find it can be helpful to discuss that quote, bias is why positionality and transparency matters for everyone, not just for insider researchers. Educate people about reflexivity as an alternative to the idea of objectivity. It can also be just a downright ableism issue where there's an idea that autistic people can't be doing these types of things. And I can find in that case, sometimes it's helpful to just ask people if they would feel the same way about men doing research on men's health. And those types of analogies can sometimes help the people to realize that there is an ableist bias that they themselves hold that they're not necessarily aware of. Also, there is literally no evidence that insider researchers have unacceptable bias. And there's research that supports that. It can be helpful to point people to research about our value, and we are scientists. Scientists respect science. Use science, it's got a lot of power. The other type of bias argument that I get is that there is no way to eliminate bias with community co-researchers. So this idea that community engaged research will introduce a bias. And this is a very similar thing, except it gets applied to the whole team. And it's also something that can be an ableism issue. So community engaged research, most people who make this argument don't really understand what community engaged research is, that it's an approach to science, it is not a methodology, and that it still uses all of the normal scientific methods with the same rigor as traditional approaches. All of those things that we do to make good science, without community engagement, we also, statistics, qualitative coding, all of that. And sometimes too, I found that it can be worth as part of educating people to share that action research has been around since the 40s. It's been used with non-autistic people extensively without any issues. There's tons of research, it's all over the place. Again, just point them back to the science, use the science. It's something that they often will respect, even when they don't, unfortunately, respect us. But you should respect yourself. Do not undersell your value. And this is a work in progress, I think, for all of us. We are academic researchers. We are scientists. We should expect to be treated with the same respect as our non-autistic colleagues. Unfortunately, it still happens all the time. It may even have happened to you. Exploitation, tokenization, assignment into non-scientific advisory roles, which, unless that is the role you want, in which case, yay, you're right in the place where you should be. But if it's not the role you want, these things are unacceptable and they should not keep happening. They should be called out. Internally, sometimes these things get internalized as feeling like we must make up for our disability or work twice as hard for half as much. All of these things are part of how ableist structures impact us and impact our work. And as we work, we are doing more and more every day through taking neurodiversity lenses to our research and to our work and to our teams, and through initiatives such as this one, that helps to break down those structures, but be aware that they are there, and don't sell yourself short. Don't let them get to you if you can. Also, don't compromise on the community's values either. This is, Aspire, when we first started, we really struggled with a lot of very, very strong opposition to autistic adults, to anything that was neurodiversity framed, to all of those things. And we just drew some lines in the sand. We said, we are not going to use language that is offensive, that the community hates. And we found ways around that. And there are always ways around these things as we build up to a better world. AIRP itself is seeking to facilitate research that is better aligned with the community and that takes neurodiversity and disability rights frames so that you don't have to compromise community values for science or career. This is great. Through this initiative or other things that you're involved in, use science to subvert and disrupt ableist assumptions. We have the science now. For example, there's real research on community preferences about language to describe autism. Now we don't have to take such sneaky ways around. We can say, look, there's research that says this is the language you use and why. That is something that we build towards, something that all of us together are doing. Find ways to make a case for neurodiversity and community priorities. For example, you can define upfront in your grant proposals that you are doing certain things out of respect for the community, out of respect for people who have been marginalized, cite, and then proceed as if it wasn't even a question that this is the right thing to do. all of that, all of the power that we've been able to get and the change that we've been able to make, we are still not in an optimal position. And sometimes we do need to use, identify and use allies. And these may be people who are other researchers on your team. They might be your mentors. They might be other colleagues. Sometimes they can take down some barriers where people who are resistant to autistic people saying something, because as a non-autistic voice, they provide the correct, quote, legitimacy as a knowledge source that we may not. It's not the best solution, but it is something that we can do, particularly as we are better connected than a lot of people within the community due to the fact that we exist within an academic research context. All of that gets to systems change, and I'm a systems scientist. I'm a total systems geek, and to me, all of this stuff is working toward how do we actually make things better for the community. So just briefly, I want to tell you your very existence as a researcher, as an autism researcher, is critically important to changing anything. You have the power to change what research is being done. You can help align it with community priorities. You can report on your research in ways that are respectful to the community and that change public discourse about autism, and that set an example for other researchers. You can change how people view insider researchers and legitimize our experience. You can help to destigmatize autism and neurodivergence within the academy as you work with inside of it. And as your career progresses, you can find ways to use your power to change those academic structures themselves, apply neurodiversity frames in more settings, and ultimately improve things back for the autistic community. So I appreciate you, and I am so glad that we are doing this work together.